Welcome to Massey College. Bienvenue. My name is Nathalie Des Rosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you virtually to this beautiful college. Massey College is built on Indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We want to acknowledge their stewardship of the land and also our commitment to this land. We're so delighted to have the possibility of working here, particularly today to celebrate another piece of Massey's history, the publication of Fifth Business. I want to thank Ramsay Derry for the idea behind the first part of this program. I'm really indebted to his leadership of the Massey Book Club for so many years, and I think it's in that spirit that we are thinking about this feature today of celebrating 50 years ago, the publication of Fifth Business. This event will be in two parts. The first part has been pre-recorded. It will feature Senior Fellow Ramsay Derry, who was Robertson Davies' publisher, in conversation with Senior Fellow Judith Skelton Grant, who was Robertson Davies' biographer. And we will hear Robertson Davies, the voice of Robertson Davies, by Stratford Festival star and TV star as well, Graham Abbey, who you would know is the artistic director of the Festival Players of Prince Edward County, after spending 20 years as one of the leading actors at the Stratford Festival. He's also the founder and artistic director of the Groundling Theatre Company in Toronto. So following this event, we will have a critical read and a discussion of what it means today to read Fifth Business with Senior Fellow and Professor of English Randy Boyagoda, Junior Fellow and PhD student in English student Apala, and Principal Emeritus Hugh Segal. But first, let's hear the story of the publication of Fifth Business.
In 1969, I was working as an editor at the Macmillan Company of Canada, now long defunct, but then one of the two major Canadian book publishers, the other being Maclellan and Stewart. In early December, Robertson Davies let us know that he was ready to send us the manuscript of his new novel. We received this news with some apprehension. Davies was then in his late 50s, the founding head of Massey College, and the most eminent man of letters in Canada. He'd published 3 much-enjoyed novels, now known as the Sultan Trilogy. He had been the most performed playwright in the country. He'd been the editor of the most highly regarded small city newspaper in the country, the Peterborough Examiner, and he was well known as a critic, an essayist, and humorist, and as a promoter of Canadian culture, as well as having been associated with the establishment of the Stratford Shakespearean Festival. However, much of that seemed in the past. His last full-length play, Love and Libel, produced nearly 10 years before, had been a distinguished failure on Broadway. His last novel, A Mixture of Frailties, published in 1958, was admired, but now considered somewhat arrière-garde compared to the new wave of Canadian writers a generation younger than Davies, like Margaret Atwood, Michael Ondaatje, and Graham Gibson. His academic position at Massey seemed so demanding, and he was so eminent, and in a person so imposing and apparently antiquated presence, that it seemed neither necessary nor probable that he'd be able to produce any further major literary work. About this new novel, with its forbidding obscure title, Fifth Business, he had murmured rather anxiously that he had tried something different, but was uncertain if it worked. Otherwise, we knew nothing about this novel, neither what it was about, nor how long Davies had been working on it, nor what it was what the setting was, nor whether it was comic or serious. The manuscript, beautifully typed on very high quality stock by Davies' devoted secretary, Miss Whalen, was brought by Davies himself to our office on December 11th and was handed off to me as Macmillan's fiction editor. In fact, As Judith Skelton Grant, the author of the major biography of Robertson Davies, explains, he had been thinking about this novel and planning it for the past nearly 10 years.
In 1958, an image began to float insistently to the surface of Davies' mind. It came unbidden, again and again, acquiring more detail and definition with each successive appearance. This is how he later described it.
A winter's night on a village street, which in time I recognized as a street I knew well from childhood. After a while the scene was peopled by two boys, and one was throwing a snowball, and I knew the snowball had a stone concealed in it.
The boys were running along a street in Thamesville, the southwestern Ontario village where Davies had lived with his family in his early childhood, and which was the model for Deptford in the novel. One boy, Dunstan Ramsay, who became the narrator of the story, was hurrying home for dinner. The other, his friend and enemy, Boy Staunton, calling abuse at him and throwing a snowball containing a rock after him. When the first boy ducked, the snowball hit the head of a pregnant woman walking ahead of him, causing the premature birth of a third boy, Paul Dempster, later known as Magnus Isengrim. The relations and connections among these three over the succeeding decades form the plot of Fifth Business. Eventually, after a couple of years, Davies realized he had to deal with this waking dream, deliberately called it to mind, and wrote 3 pages of notes. The ensuing 8 years kept the surface of Davies' mind busy as he taught courses in drama at Trinity College, accepted Vincent Massey's invitation to become the founding master of Massey College, collaborated with the Masseys and architect Ron Thom on the planning of the building, and then set the life of the college in motion, taught in the U of T's graduate school, and designed the university's graduate program. He also wrote a weekly column for the Toronto Star, gave a popular series of lectures about the plays to be performed at the Stratford Festival, wrote several plays, published a book of essays about trends in writing and literature. He also had to deal with the complications, both practical and emotional, of the death of his father, Senator Rupert Davies. Nonetheless, by 1964, the novel was pretty clear in his mind.
My long-pondered tale of the woman who was robbed of her wits by an act of malignance on the part of a child, and who lives the life of a saint, and who is requited for it with confinement in a madhouse. Setting Thamesville as the root. Characters: the man of wealth who begins as the bad boy, Mrs. Dempster, the saint, wife of a Methodist parson, her son who becomes a famous conjurer, Dunstan Ramsay, the chronicler, who was the only one to know the whole story.
Davies' own life fed into Fifth Business in many ways, and he was keenly aware of this. A few months before the writing began, he told his Oxford friend Horace Davenport in a letter,
"It is autobiographical, but not as young men do it. It will be rather as Dickens wrote David Copperfield, a fictional reworking of some things experienced and much rearranged. A spiritual autobiography, in fact, and not a sweating account of the first time I backed a girl into a corner. I choose the word spiritual with intent, for during the past 10 years the things of the spirit have become increasingly important to me, not in a churchy sense, though as master of this college I have to attend chapel and look serious, but in what I must call a Jungian sense. That may make you laugh or spit. But through C.G.J.'s ever-thickening veils of thought and fantasy, I discern something that gives great richness to my life, and helps me to behave rather more decently toward other people than my unaided inspiration can achieve. And that is important to me. The world is so full of self-seekers, crooks, and sons of bitches that I'm keen to be a decent man, not a holy Joe or a do-gooder, but a man who does not gag every time he looks in a mirror."
It was only at the end of August 1968 that he notes in his diary that he began writing, and he revisited the setting that opens the novel.
Today made a start on fifth business, only a page and a half, but the vital report of the school's farewell to Dunstan Ramsay that provokes him to make his statement to the headmaster. Sunday, September 1st, 1968. We drive to Thamesville, reaching there about 12:30. I want to see it again as background to fifth business. Changed, of course, but the population is still 500. Ferguson building gone, so the Opera House is no more. Streets raised, so not so many steps up to the shops. The Herald for sale. My birthplace rather gaudily done up, trees gone and hardly recognizable. St. James Church tight shut on Sunday. Very Presbyterian. No unsupervised or unauthorized worship there. Ferguson's Woods gone and Ferguson's Mansion, the only 3-story house in town, now a nursing home. Picnicked by the Sherman Cemetery and found graves of many people I had known. A melancholy visit, as by its nature it must be. I make a real start on fifth business after my trial run last week. Do the opening incident and enjoy it greatly. To work at last. The writing goes smoothly, and I'm a little afraid of it. But problems will come soon enough.
Once underway, Davies wrote with professional speed. The first 2 sections of the novel were written during the fall of 1968, in time snatched from his work as professor and Massey College head. By December 2nd, he had written 25,000 words. By the end of the following summer, the whole first draft was finished. His secretary, Miss Whalen, who had been with him for 12 years and was the only person other than Brenda to have read the manuscript, raised several pages of queries. As well as copy editing matters, she would find inconsistencies in the names of characters, illogicalities in the ages assigned to characters from one reference to the next, and the like. The final draft was finished in the first week of December, and he immediately lost confidence in it.
December 9th. In the evening, think about fifth business. So considered, so labored over. But now it seems to me shallow and obvious. Is this the best of me? December 11th, 1969. I leave my manuscript of fifth business at Macmillan's.
By chance, I had earlier been a student at Davies' undergraduate lectures at Trinity College, and also occasionally had met him and his wife Brenda as the hospitable parents of one of my university friends, Miranda Davies. I liked and admired him, but found it unlikely and alarming that I should now presume to function as his editor. I only later found out what he thought. I took the manuscript away with me for a weekend in Montreal and began reading it on the train. I was about 60 pages into it when I had that marvelous sensation that publishers and editors only rarely experience. The hair on the back of my neck literally prickled and began to rise as I realized that this was a really terrific book. The narrative voice in the central character, Dunstan Ramsay, was, with its dynamic combination of irony and romantic enthusiasm, it was secure and compelling, and the story was wonderfully discursive, but had tremendous pace. The main setting and major characters were intensely Canadian, but the themes were universal. It created a reality so strong that if we had just locked the manuscript away in a drawer, the lives of its characters would have continued throbbing away. When I returned to the office on Monday, I ran about the halls shouting that Robertson Davies had written a great book, until I was shushed by my colleagues, particularly the company's chairman, John Gray, a good and worthy man who is now close to the end of his career and motivated in those years chiefly by caution. I wanted to congratulate Davies, but Mr. Gray thought we should be careful not to get Davies' hopes up until we were certain we wanted to publish. Meanwhile, most of my colleagues were somewhat cool in their response to the book. A copy of the manuscript would now be sent to our likely co-publishers, Macmillan in London and Scribner's, Davies' previous US publisher, in New York. Davies wrote in his diary,
January 12, 1970. Phone call from Ramsay Derry of Macmillan's, in a sweat to get a script of fifth business to send to Macmillan's in England. He will not discuss proposed alterations with me. How pompous publishers are. In the evening I look through the book again. This talk of changes unnerves me. I take 8 years to plan and write a book. They can improve it in 8 days.
A month later, he was still waiting to hear from his publishers.
February 13th, day of ill omen. Letter from my New York agent, Josephine Rogers. Scribners have refused fifth business. I suppose they expected a funny book. I am understandably cast down, but not too much. After all, I've had some premonition this might be the case. Josephine Rogers is going to try Viking. As they have no previous knowledge of me, they will see the book as it is, per se. I feel dull and talentless and a fraud, as if Scribners were only right to refuse fifth business. March 14th. The day began well with a call from Hugh Kane, the second in command at Macmillan, who wanted to tell me about a reader's report the English firm have received about fifth business. Terms like delectable treat, strong, subtle, tidy, and precise, profound in various ways, nicest kind of dry wit, a joyously funny book, all of which is music to my ears, for the Scribner refusal has shaken me. March 20th. Josephine Rogers on the phone, and to my great delight, Viking want fifth business, and indeed, she reports them to be enthusiastic about it. She asked me to call Hugh Kane, and I do so, and he seems to know it already. It seems Viking had decided some days ago, but wanted another opinion. But Kane says John Gray still has reservations and wants to discuss some changes. I walk across the quad and discuss this with Margaret Lawrence, who is staying in the college, and she advises me strongly not to yield to this sort of tinkering. March 21st. In the evening to John Gray's to a dinner for Alan MacLean, the managing director of London Macmillan, a nice Englishman who speaks very flatteringly about fifth business and seems covertly to counsel me against making any changes. Apparently the Viking man also sees no need for heavy alteration, though they all have odd little queries, like how much was a VC really worth in money and have I checked it? The Greys are dears but nervous party givers. They do not gently lead their guests. They defer to them, and a certain uneasy muddle results.
So it was only after about a dozen readings in over 3 months, after the manuscript was originally submitted to us, and with the commitment of our co-publishers, Macmillan in London and Viking in New York, that we cautiously informed Davies that we would publish. At a rather excruciating meeting with him at the York Club, an awfully refined gentleman's club just along Bloor Street from here, my colleagues and I alluded tentatively to some editorial problems. Davies, in exasperation, exclaimed,
"What are these problems? Must I put the end at the beginning? Should I change my men into women?"
No, we said, nothing like that, only a few small points. But there was the problem of the title. Surely it would put people off. What did it mean? Prepared for this question, Davies, who was dressed characteristically in a complex ensemble of waistcoat and jacket, both accoutred with an inordinate number of buttons and pockets, withdrew from one of his pockets a card on which was written in his beautiful italic handwriting the definition of fifth business, together with a Danish scholarly source. This red herring, which we collectively swallowed as though it were aquavit, was subsequently printed at the beginning of the book. No one questioned the explanation of this term and its source until several years later, when the Norwegian translator spotted the fraud. Davies described the meeting in his diary.
After some discussion, it is decided that I shall not revise the book along the lines of excising its confession to the headmaster element, nor yet heat up its coolness. But I agree to touch up the incident of Dunstan Ramsay winning the VC, about which I have always been dubious, for I know nothing of such matters, and John Gray, who does, can keep me from silly mistakes. I am pleased that they all like the book so much. I have an odd sense of being valued as an author. Viking are giving me a much better contract than any I've had before, and I know my agent will use this to screw more money out of Macmillan's. So I may really think of myself as a success in modest terms, in having succeeded by my own efforts in a realm where no one else in my family can touch me. This means more to me than anyone can ever know, for I have always been treated by my brothers and my father as a dreamer and rather a fool.
It was agreed that I would present him with a list of my own questions, as well as those from other readers. And the following day, I dropped the list of suggestions and queries for Davies here at his office at Massey. He responded briskly and very professionally at the comparatively trifling editorial queries I put to him. I now have no recollection of what they were, but Davies wrote in his diary,
"Phone talk with Ramsay Derry about the battle scene. How the publishers fuss about exactitude in a situation where I want everything to be phantasmagoria, dream grotto. We compromise. Later talk with Ramsay about the jacket for the book. I yearn for something distinguished and curiosity compelling. They lean toward a foolish little dinkus of 4 white squares and 1 black square, which one is supposed to interpret as the 5th business among the other elements. God! I want Dunstan Ramsay flogging Liesel with his wooden leg, or something really interesting like that."
Nonetheless, we moved ahead swiftly, and the book was ready for the publishing date at the end of October.
October 23rd, 1970. Ramsay Derry comes at 6:30 with 5 copies of 5th Business. He brought one this morning, which I immediately gave to Brenda, but he knew I would want others as soon as I could get them. I am surprised and delighted at the excitement this book has already generated.
The novel he had written was the work of a writer in full command of his creative powers, proceeding intensely and inevitably from beginning to end. No longer did Davies feel the need to distance himself from his characters with comic omniscience as he had in the Sultan Trilogy. Now he was willing to risk the more direct expression of his own feeling to realize a character from within. He was consistently sure in his handling of his material, from the scenes rooted in the remembered reality of Thamesville through to those drawn from imagination. As he traced the stages by which his hero gains self-knowledge, he creates a story in which many Canadians recognized their nation's struggle towards self-recognition and national identity. 5th Business is a wholly compelling book of idiosyncratic vision and can fairly be called one of the important novels of the 20th century.
Eventually, my Macmillan colleagues had begun to share my enthusiasm for the book, and we decided we should give it a really good launch party. Usually Macmillan's launches were rather discreet affairs, typically a quiet cocktail party with no more than 2 or 3 dozen guests, unlike the far more flamboyant event staged by our amiable rivals McClellan and Stewart. By chance, just at this time, a new restaurant called Captain John's had opened. It was a retired passenger ship permanently tied up in Toronto Harbour at the bottom of Yonge Street. As you may recall, in 5th Business, this was exactly the location where the anti-hero, Boyce Staunton, had drowned himself by driving his Cadillac convertible car into the harbour, and was discovered to have died with a pebble in his mouth. Thus, Captain John seemed a perfect, if macabre, setting for the launch, and we took over the entire restaurant for the evening and staged a party of a couple of 100 people. As we planned the party, we decided we should give some kind of souvenir of the event. At the time, I lived beside the lake in Port Credit, and before work one morning, I went down to the beach and filled a large pail with mouth-side pebbles, which I took into our office, and we rubber-stamped each one with Robertson Davies' signature in his italic handwriting. We gave each guest one of these pebbles, and I still have mine as a paperweight on my desk. Davies described the party in his diary.
October 30th, to Captain John's Restaurant, a boat in the harbour at the foot of Yonge Street, where Macmillans are giving a party to launch 5th Business. Good atmosphere. Big enough not to be noisy, yet not vast. Guests of all sorts, academia, book trade people, and just friends. Great supper spread and lots of drinks. The first thing I see is the representative of the university newspaper, the Varsity, a giant yokel of apparently about 16, gobbling an immense plate of food. He introduces himself at once. "I guess I'm the only one here without a tie on. Yuck, yuck." Says he is new at this game and asks me to autograph a book. Great variety of people. Meet the fabled Anna Zygethy of McClellan and Stewart, who is indeed a beauty and a charmer, but also, I should think, a rather dangerous little lady. am assailed by Roy Britnell of Britnell's Bookshop with one of his tales of old, unhappy, far-off things, and also by the manager of Smith's Bookshop, who wants to say that Fifth Business is a bad title and he wishes I had chosen another. Also, he feels the theme of the book stands between it and popularity. But on the whole, a very nice group, and easy to talk to. Macmillan's had hired a conjurer who does some good tricks, such as announcing the Macmillans have a hot property in Fifth Business, and then opening a copy which bursts into flame. But he was no Eisengrim. Pat Johnson, the headmaster of Upper Canada College, is there, and stunned to learn that the whole book is a letter to the headmaster of a barely disguised Upper Canada College. Josephine Rogers, my New York agent, is almost equally stunned to find that the headmaster and his school are, in her expression, for real. Altogether a delightful party, and I think I did the right thing. Talked to everybody, was genial, and did not play the author aggressively. That was done by Morley Callahan, who treed me to talk as if we were beyond the common throng. But he was interesting. Tells me Mordecai Richler is a disappointed man. He wanted to make it in New York and didn't. His comic novel Cocksure only sold 4,000 copies. Richler fears he may be only a journalist. Morley was genial to me, I don't know why. Still much better a friend than a foe. Melisande Irvine keeps holding my hand to her stomach in a delightfully Latin fashion, but why? It was warm and pulsed. I drank soda water all evening. We took leave at 11. The last thing I saw as I left was the varsity troglodyte cramming himself with lobster mayonnaise. To bed, well pleased.
Fifth Business was a commercial and critical triumph in Canada and then internationally, though there was more reserve in the Canadian reviews than elsewhere, in part perhaps because some Canadian critics, familiar with Davies' eminence, were reluctant to acknowledge that he had indeed done something new and exceptional. And although in retrospect Fifth Business was seen as the outstanding Canadian novel of the year, it did not win the Governor-General's Award, which was then the country's major annual literary prize, and which went to a writer of a younger generation.
For most American reviewers, Fifth Business was their first exposure to Davies, and for them, the novel was a revelation. It fell into none of the usual categories. It was unlike the work of any major U.S. novelists of the day. They recognized its craftsmanship, intelligence, perceptiveness, and maturity of vision. The New York Times Review concluded, a marvelously enigmatic novel, elegantly written and driven by irresistible narrative force. One thinks of The Magic Mountain and The French Lieutenant's Woman, although Mr. Davies hardly needs Thomas Mann and John Fowles to prop him up.
In the aftermath of the book's publication, I was interviewed by a postgraduate student who was writing an essay about the making of a bestseller. Eager to promote my part in the story, I talked about the editor's role, about how important it was to have the courage to put questions to the author, however accomplished or distinguished he or she may be, even at the risk of seeming obtuse. When the same interviewer asked Davies about the value of editorial advice, he remarked,
"Editors are damn stupid people who ask damn stupid questions."
It was an observation I did not dispute, and that caused not a ripple in our friendship, which lasted until his death in 1995. As for Robertson Davies as a has-been, Fifth Business was followed by its sequels in the Stratford Trilogy, The Manticore and World of Wonders, and then by 5 more novels, as well as books of essays, another play, an opera libretto, and other works over the next quarter century.
So this was really fascinating to hear about the story of the publication and how important Fifth Business is in the life of Robertson Davies, almost his rebirth after a silence of 10 years. But the book was published 50 years ago, and now with my guest, I want to explore how does it read 50 years later, and to discuss that, I'll start with our good friend and new senior fellow, Randy Boyagoda. So Randy is, as we well know, the Vice Dean undergraduate for the Faculty of Arts and Science. He's a professor of English at the University of Toronto. He was for 4 years, from 2016 to 2020, the principal of St. Michael's College. He's the author of 5 books, 3 novels, essays, reviews. We read him in the New York Times and the Globe and Mail, and he's also a regular presence on CBC Radio. So let me start with you, Randy. How do you read Fifth Business in 2020?
Thank you very much, Natalie, for the opportunity to chat about this, this really, I think, unexpectedly relevant book. I really very much enjoyed watching that film just now and learning so much about the kind of inner life of both the book and of its author during its during its lead up to publication. As a working novelist with an academic administrative appointment, you can imagine that I was listening quite closely to a lot of what was going through Davies' mind, and I certainly identified at multiple occasions with some of the challenges and demands, and even I think aspirations that he described. I think I'd want to take a few minutes to think about how I read Fifth Business now, as opposed to, let's say, when I would have first read it, probably right around the time of Davies' death in 1995, when I had just started my undergraduate studies at Trinity College at the University of Toronto as an English student. And I think the best way maybe to frame my remarks would be to think a little bit about an analogy provided by Lionel Trilling, the great New York literary critic of mid-century. And Trilling, right around 1950 or so, wrote an essay about Ernest Hemingway's novel, The Green Hills of Africa. And he basically suggested that there was a problem with how Hemingway's work had developed. Because he said there were 2 Hemingways. There was Hemingway, and then there was Hemingway. And his point was basically that the public standing, the public reputation of Hemingway kind of got in the way of his writing, because he had stopped writing about life and the world around him and started writing to and from his public reputation. And I think one of the challenges for someone like me who would have come to Davies later in life, although I think even as Ramsay and Judith were just suggesting, even upon the publication of Fifth Business, there was a sense of a kind of an accreted reputation around Davies that was hard to kind of break through. So for someone like me, as a suburban child of South Asian immigrants growing up in suburban Oshawa in the 1990s, Davies was a godsend. Why? Because at that point, for someone with literary ambitions, Davies looked, in a sense, exactly what I thought a writer should look like at that point in my, let's say, Anglophilic youth. In that, he had the beard, he had this kind of grand presence, all these pockets everywhere. He seemed to me to look like what I imagined a Canadian author would look like. And I probably read him or overread that reputation, that Davies, into the work. A couple of years ago, and then eventually I kind of got sick of it, as you can imagine, in that I certainly thought that his later work, I think to some degree, suffered from the problem that I was describing via Hemingway, Trilling on Hemingway, of kind of writing to and from the reputation. And a couple of years ago, the very fine Canadian journal, Canadian Notes and Queries, asked me to write on Fifth Business, what I made of it in whatever it was, I guess 2018. And so with, I guess, a certain amount of bated breath, I went back and I reread it. And I was worried, because as I think we all have this experience, anyone listening right now, you read a book at a certain point in life, and it really affects you in a profound way. And some books, and I would cite something like George Eliot's Middlemarch, you read for the rest of your life, over and over again, every few years. Other books, and I would cite something like Catcher in the Rye, you never want to read twice, because the magic is gone the second time. You see all the moves too easily. I was worried that Fifth Business was going to be in that second category, that in rereading it, now, I would see less the literary strengths of it and more my own weaknesses for a certain understanding of what a book should be. And so I read it in that context, and I would suggest that I was profoundly surprised, especially by the first 100 pages. I would say that those first 100 pages, where Davies explores the world of Deptford from the kind of retrospective perspective of this aging retired headmaster looking back at a very different point in his life, this childhood, were amazing. They struck me as providing a sense of the depth and universality of human experience that we unexpectedly find in small towns, the kind of thing you see in the works of Thomas Hardy, of William Faulkner, of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, in a very different way in the work of Elena Ferrante. And I was really struck by that when it came to that evocation of Deptford. The rest of it is enjoyable. The rest of it is, strange and mysterious, exactly as Davies was probably seeking. And while I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the kind of the plot mechanisms that end with the pebble in the mouth, it was, to be honest, to my mind at least, kind of very good literary fiction. But that first 100 pages struck me as literature. Yeah, as work of permanent relevance, classic in that sense. And I very much enjoyed it. I would say that the other thing, and maybe I'll end here because I'm keen to hear what Apala thinks of the book, and Hugh if he's with us. But I'll end with this other point, something else that struck me. If Davies was an easy figure for acclaim in kind of public Canadian culture and literary life for so much of his career, now he is kind of exhibit A punching bag, right? I mean, the person of Robertson Davies embodies everything, again, Davies, everything that we're trying to get past these days in terms of Canadian, a cosmopolitan, globally minded, inclusive Canadian literary community and understanding of what we can and should be writing about. In retrospect, I want to give maybe in conclusion 2 cheers for Fifth Business. Right now it would seem at first glance like a book about a very narrow, homogeneous time and place. But I think that exposes more our own illiteracy than anything else. If you think about the small world of Deptford, the small world of Deptford is not just a group of white people, which is the easy way to dismiss it, right? But if you think about it, the Deptford that Davies conjures is full of division and conflict. And that division and conflict is ethnic, it's religious, and it's class-based. And in retrospect, if we look forward, let's say, there will never be a moment, I hope, where people would simply dismiss a given South Asian writer as just writing about brown people, as if every South Asian writer is writing about some broad category of brown people, right? What a disappointment. And so why don't we apply that same logic to Davies and be mindful of the fact that at least in the time he was writing about, if not that kind of hinge moment in Canadian literary life, there was a heterogeneity, an explosive heterogeneity at work in the world of Fifth Business. And I think it's what provides the book with the kind of vitality that remains alive and engaging today.
Thank you so much. Actually, it's wonderful to have your commentary and your first take. And before I get to Hugh, I just want to get to Apala because you read it for the first time recently because I asked you to, and you're not Canadian. You arrive here, and the head of the college asked you to read a book. So I want to thank you for doing this. And so I want to ask you whether you think that that Fifth Business helps you understand Canada, and whether you would even recommend it to your friends, people of your generation, or for people like you who just arrived a couple of years ago.
Yes, first of all, thanks Nathalie for giving me this wonderful opportunity not to just read this book. I had no idea how important this book was, even when I started reading it. when I finished reading it and I went online to research it, and I heard so I came to know how important this book was. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity, but also to be on the same panel as Randy and Hugh and you. So I guess I have just a couple of points to make about. And again, as Randy said, I am the first time reader, so I'm pretty sure I trust what he's talking about, reading it for the second time or the third time. Because when I read it first, I kind of did not categorize it with novels like Middlemarch, or even as the documentary we just saw, in which in which uh, uh, in which Davies himself compares it to something like a David Copperfield. I did not initially in my first reading, I have to admit, I did not associate it with books like that, novels like that, and it's in fact I kind of thought of the novel as something that is not like that. And so I'm going to come to that. So that's one thing that I thought about, but I'm pretty sure that if I read the book again, as Randy suggested, that my views might change. And the second thing that I wanted to talk about was also to some extent hinted at by Randy, was the question of foreignness, the presence of foreignness in the book. And there too, I felt like our preliminary impression of the book and of how it's a very closed world, closed settler world. It's not even a closed Canadian world. I mean, that's at least how I would want to look at it right now. It's a very closed Christian world, and in fact, the closeness of the world also includes the fact that it is an extremely male narrative, right? So it's closed even at that level. So to me, that appeared to me when I read the book. But at the same time, I completely agree with what Randy just said. That by the time I finished reading the book, it occurred to me that what was going on there was a lot of, as Randy said, conflicts. It was showing us a world of conflicts. Although the way it was not entirely showing it to us. It was almost telling us about what was going on in that world of conflicts. But it does indeed show a world of conflicts, and so that's something that we can probably take away from the book. But coming back to my or maybe just let me just wrap up the second part I'm already making. So as I said, that it's a given that there is very little presence of foreignness in the novel. It's published in 1970, which is probably not yet Canada and Toronto or even Ontario. Obviously, suburban Ontario is, I'm assuming, not at all the way we see it today, which is extremely much more cosmopolitan and multicultural. So I'm pretty so that's what I'm assuming, that there is very little presence of foreignness simply because there was more space for foreignness. But at the same time, I noticed a few references, very brief references in the book. One made in passing to the Arabian Nights, and one made in passing to which to me kind of, I'm a little confused, but which to me kind of seemed like a slight hint of anti-Semitism, where he's talking about the Arabs in Israel. And but again, I mean, this is just my first impression of it. I just felt like these references in passing to what is considered to be the absolute other of, or absolutely for two white Canadian or white settler communities, to me seemed like not as badly handled as I would have expected. You know what I mean? So what he's saying that it refers to the Arabian Nights. He says that something along the lines of the Arabian Nights comes close to it's kind of a similar text as the Bible, and he's saying it in a context. Obviously, he's saying it in. I am not sure if it is his. I mean, because it's also. I mean, we don't know how much we can rely on the narrator of the business, but. So yeah, I mean, that just made me feel these kinds of references that we do not. I guess we do not still need to assume that since there is an absence of foreignness in the book, that Robertson Davies himself had any antagonistic attitude towards the foreignness.
Yeah.
So that's what I thought. And coming back to the critical, the element of the fact that it's an epistolary novel, and comparing this novel with novels like Middlemarch or David Copperfield, my assessment of it lay in the core idea of fifth business. So fifth business being this character in a sort of theatrical setup that leads the action, the compounded action of the play. And to me, when I started reading the book, it felt like this narrative is kind of third person or personal, kind of biographical, autobiographical, but still kind of a third person narrative. In a sense that it's an omniscient narrative, and so on. But I think what in my mind distinguished this novel from something like David Copperfield or Middlemarch is that there seemed to me to be a lack of a critical element that it is dealing with, engaging with a lot of social. It's a very social novel. It's engaging with religion. It's engaging with sectarianism, with society, with gender, and so on. But there was that lack of critical element that appeared to me in the first reading, which we find so wonderfully even in first-person narratives and omniscient narratives, in realist narratives like David Copperfield, for instance. And that's why those kind of live with us and make sense to us a lot more. And so yeah, this is kind of, I guess, what I thought about. And of course, I would I don't know. I mean, the misogynistic elements are very clear here. I mean, that's something that I would.
Yes, you and I want to talk about this a little bit
yes,
as the role of women.
It's just something we can't avoid. So I would probably I'll wait for you to, if you want to address that at some point, but then.
So let's bring Hugh. Let's bring Hugh, and then we'll have a conversation together, right? So Hugh, so you rereading Fifth Business in 2020. Were you surprised by your rereading it, and elements that you did not remember from it?
So look, full disclosure, I don't read fiction. Generally speaking, I avoid fiction. There's enough fiction in life to which we are all subjected that reading it beyond that is not something which has ever struck me as a good use of time. I did read it back at university, but I haven't read it for a long time. I reread it gladly. And look, it's a very well-written magisterial book. The language is very impressive, embraces the full range from personal to sacred to mystical to political to scatological to hagiographic. And the richness of the writing, its sweep and eclectic structure, textured reach and depth makes this book very special, and a clear reflection of Robertson Davies' immense skill and creative power. Having said that, without imposing today's standards on a book that was written half a century ago about events that took place half a century earlier, there are some things in the book that were, for me, as I read it, troubling, not because they don't fit with our present view, as Appia suggested, but I think they are a narrow view and misrepresentation of where the world was, even in the era about which he wrote. If you think about it, a small Ontario town, embracing World War I, war, private school, business, political careers, the life of a traveling circus, the culture of a traveling magic group in Mexico. The way in which Davies describes the characters betrays some attributable characterizations that I did find somewhat uncomfortable. Women are treated, except near the end, as having little agency. They're described in terms of physical features, very much in terms of how well they serve the male characters in the story. Or they're described as victims, which may be where the storyteller chooses to go, but it is the kind of characterization that sustains some of the historical roots of misogyny, which is not absent from aspects of our sort of present political and media context. It's not a problem that has gone away. If you think about the author's own life, which is very impressive as a journalist, academic administrator, playwright, novelist, publisher, all of that is reflected in his superb writing, and readers benefit immensely from it. But I react with some meaningful discomfort to the narrowness of his description of fictional small-town Ontario, to the remarkable fictional self-indulgence of searching for saints, or the fictional betrayal of politics and business. None of it is portrayed as constructive. It's all portrayed as the seamy side of life. And like you, Natalie, I've been through small-town Ontario. I've been to some very small towns, and I've been there over the years. And and I've been there many years ago. And there, small town Ontario isn't quite the white Protestant, white Catholic bastion, and it wasn't necessarily 50 years ago. There were other parts of those communities who, for whatever reason, didn't become part of the fictional construct that Mr. Davies put into this book. Now, look, fiction and fiction writers get to make things up. That's what they do. And they are not required to provide footnotes or bibliographies or citations. But I would argue that they do carry a responsibility for the sense of the world they create through their fiction. Robertson Davies is, as a personality and as a writer, a pillar of our national culture, as are his many novels. While we like to think, as Abra said, our national culture is expansive and creative and egalitarian and inclusive, we all know that even today that is actually not completely true. There are some pretty serious gaps in that, particularly as it relates to gender equity and identity, First Nations rights, discrimination, Black, Indigenous, people of color. It's not as broad and inclusive a society today as we would find optimal. There's little in fifth business that mediates against the narrowness and towards more inclusivity in any way, shape, or form, even 50 years ago. And, by 1970, we had a Bill of Rights in Canada. It wasn't constitutionalized, but it was a statutory base that it operated. We had a series of important decisions about discrimination, and none of that reality shows up in the fiction that Robertson Davies decided to create. And by the way, I'm not in any way questioning his motivation or his decency, but I'm saying that in the fiction, in the way in which he chose to portray the story he told, he contributed to a sense of a culture that was quite exclusionary. And I think that for these days is problematic. The other thing that I would say is the interesting question which I always ask about any fiction writer, which is, to what extent does the fiction they write portray some autobiographical nature of themselves? And one of the most fascinating parts of the book is where he is contracted as he's part of a Mexican magic tour made up of one individual who comes from the old hometown to actually produce a faux biography for the star of that show. It's a faux biography, and that's why he's retained, because the people around the magician in chief have decided that this particular character created, named Dunson, he's the guy who's actually going to do that full biography. So the question you always ask is, when you describe the fifth business as the person who is to the side of the main fray, not in the fray, not a major actor, to what extent is the author in some way reflecting on himself, despite all the tremendously active and important roles he played in Canadian culture and literature and academe and journalism and all the rest? Now, I don't know the answer to that. Judith Grant may know the answer to that because she was his biographer, but that's a question that occurred to me. So would I recommend the book? I think my instinct would be probably you should read it, in the same way as my mother said I had to have cod liver oil in the mornings when I was a little kid. Good for you, doesn't taste good, but it will give you a broader sense of understanding of one aspect of how a certain part of Canadian society operated. But, by the 1970s, by the turn of the century, we had major ethnic groups who were coming to Canada. We had major strands of immigration. Many of our small towns had communities that were made up of First Nations adjacent to and related thereto. All of that is absent from this particular take, which, he didn't have any obligation to respond to any public policy requirements. He was writing fiction. And as such, it should be appreciated as such. But to tell you that I read the whole thing without being a little bit uncomfortable would be less than the truth.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Let's bring you all in. It's interesting to have this discussion. He wrote the book while he was at Massey. He was heading Massey College. And at that time, Massey did not accept women. It's 1970. The women came in only in 1973. So when I was reading the book, I thought it was kind of interesting how he describes how he doesn't want to teach women. The character doesn't want to teach women. And so it's an interesting way in which the women are either a victim or silent. Even she gets to not say very much, the saint woman. So I was struck by how it's a male world. Women are from the outside, they're either beautiful that need to be manipulated, but not that smart. And eventually the second wife of Boyce Taunton is seen as, a bit of a feminist, but she's not well liked by the author. So ambivalence, I would say, with the feminist movement. Is that what you did you see that, Randy? And I want to get back to the first 100 page. I agree with you. There's lots of good stuff in the first 100 page. But what about the role of women, Randy?
Well, I think that both Hugh and Apala have created some very good context for me even to reconsider my kind of two cheers apologia for Davies. There certainly is, I think, a certain amount of blindness, and that's where what becomes perhaps interesting is to think novels that are set in the past are always about the time they're set in, that they're written in as much as they are about the time they're set in the past. And so, to Hugh and Apala's points, you'd be very curious to know what the world around Davies was like when it comes to things like gender and seeing beyond, let's say, a heterogeneous whiteness that sent him elsewhere, right? And I think, Hugh, you put it well at the beginning. It doesn't make him a reactionary. It just means that he responded this way, and it created a certain amount of, I don't know, not blindness so much, but he chose his vision a certain way. Yeah, I mean, I thought it was very interesting I wish I could have heard more about how his longtime secretary, so charmingly referred to as Miss whatever that was, right? Like there's something even there that's almost antique. But how he would have dealt with that editorial relationship as opposed to his kind of outraged editorial relationship with Macmillan, what were the dynamics there? How did gender figure in how editing worked out with him? That'd be something else maybe to consider. But I very much acknowledge it that this is a male-centric book with passive female characters who become screens upon which the males, the main male characters can project their dramas, their struggles, their anxieties. Again, of a piece with perhaps a certain amount of Richler, Bellow, mid-century male American and Anglo writing generally.
Well, it's interesting. So, Apala, what you alluded to that, the sense a bit of discomfort as a young woman reading that, did you?
Yes, definitely. And it was kind of, I mean, in my mind, I was making comparisons to even say, like epistolary novels or realist narratives we read from the 18th century. Henry Fielding and people like that. Like even there, we've always been, as English literature students, we've been trained to notice these things, but also really understand how those things, how these issues or elements were kind of were treated by the narrative itself critically. That's the point that I was trying to talk about. That the narrative itself, the setting itself, treats these issues critically, and that's something that I found really lacking in this, because the narrative voice is pretty. There's a lot of agency in the narrative voice, and probably that's why I think it's pretty. I think Davies was pretty conscious of that, because that's why probably he named Fifth Business, because he didn't want it to be a sort of just a sort of audience watching something going on the stage. A character, the narrator is not passive. The narrator is pretty.
That's a great reading.
Yes, it's good.
So he is the narrator is the fifth business, that knows, and he knows where to direct his reader to. So the views that he's expressing are not views that just are sitting there in the complex of other views that or the characters. They're views that have an agenda, and in a sense, maybe agenda is a very strong word, but like.
But that's different.
Wanted his reader
so I want to invite also our audience, if you want to write your questions on the YouTube, I will put them to my panel. So I want to touch on, so I have Akash Maharaj. If Davies concocted the quotation that explained the title of Fifth Business, does the term actually have any meaning beyond what Davies ascribed to it? So you recall maybe that in the book it says that it's a word of opera, and then eventually it turned out that what he had given his editor was, fake news or false facts. Yeah. So what does it mean, Fifth Business, or is that just another fictional instrument that he used here? Randy, do you know?
Well, I wouldn't know, but I could speculate that maybe one analogy would be to the end notes to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which are also kind of made up, kind of a joke, and kind of serious all at the same time. And they're done so that you can sustain each one of those readings, right? Each one of those kind of relationships to the end notes. And I think you could probably say the same thing about Fifth Business. And maybe part of, Davies, the marketer, is that he concocts the term, and then it begins to accrete meaning on its own that then affirms what his novel has, right? It's kind of a nice circular move if you think about it.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Yeah.
I'm just going to say, go back to something which Randy said, and you referenced, Natalie, namely, he wrote this when he was then, quote unquote, the master of Massey College. And what was the context, right? So he makes references to the Board of Governors, right? And he makes reference to actually the person who his character is writing a letter to the actual master to tell him this whole story. When the writer of the letter, the main protagonist in the story, has actually wanted to be the master, but wasn't allowed to be the master, right? Because the board decided that he was too old, and that he was too esoteric in what he did. Hagiography of saints, for example, and various other things deemed to be not part of the real world at the time that the protagonist is allegedly writing this letter to the master. So, that does suggest that there is some contextual connection. If you read, if you read Robertson Davies' his own work about his time at Massey College, where he talks about it not in fictional terms but in real terms, he talks about during the construction of the college, how many times he had to go to meetings to discuss, wait for it, teapots. Right? There were several meetings which he had to attend as the designated master to be about teapots. And he asks himself in his own non-fictional writing, how many more of these do I have to attend? I have nothing to contribute to a discussion of teapots, but because I'm the master designate, I have to be at those meetings. So you get some of that exasperation, actually, in various aspects of the book. So I found that, those of us who had the privilege of being associated with Massey, and so I found that actually very, very, very evocative, and it did reflect the notion that this is a little bit of who he is.
So I have a good question from Anna Porter here. The UK publisher rejected the manuscript and no US offer came along. Would Macmillan have made an offer to publish? Well, that's a good question. I guess we should call Ramsay. As you know,
Anna can answer that question perhaps better than anybody else in terms of her understanding of Canadian and international publishing. But it was interesting to see the story, right? Of how motivations led to greater, it's classic, greater Canadian confidence when outside Canada somebody is recognized and affirmed for doing something worthwhile in an international context.
That's right.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Davies himself felt that. He seemed to be really happy.
He directly experienced it, clearly, yeah.
That's it, So
it's still an axiom. It's still an axiom of Canadian politics and the arts that doing well in Canada is okay, but doing better in New York, making a speech at the Chicago World Affairs Council is the best way to be item number one on the Canadian national news. That's still part of being up against the American looking glass, which is just part of our reality, being a smaller neighbor to the headquarters of the empire. It's to the south of us.
Well, it's interesting to continue to discuss this landmark. It's interesting to me. I did not know that it meant kind of a return of Robertson Davies to the writing profession in a way. This hiatus of 10 years and his gesture of reopening. I was going to ask you, sometimes we see in writers that they are ahead of their time. When you read Fifth Business, obviously it's set in the past, but there is a sense where, the Fifth Business is about returning to the past. It's such a value of not wanting to move forward. I was struck by this myself, and the first time I read Fifth Business, as I was explaining, is I arrived in Ontario at age 25 because I was madly in love with an Ontarian, recognized that I knew nothing of English literature because I read mostly in French, and read Fifth Business that first summer. And so now I'm thinking, well, maybe it gave me the wrong impression of Ontario. Maybe it gave me an impression of Ontario being far more conservative than it really is. I don't know. Some writers foretell the future. This to me seemed like an apology and a real search for the glorification of the past. Am I wrong about this? Randy?
I don't think you are.
I think Apala would be the right. Well, maybe Apala would be the right one to ask. I think she would have the apparel. I don't know if you've fallen in love with an Ontarian or not, Apala, but either way, in being a kind of newcomer to the text, I'd be curious to know what you think.
Yes, I think I felt really distant from the text in that sense, about what I think of the place that I inhabit now. Although, I've been living within 50 meters of Robarts Library for the last 3 years, so I 100 meters actually. So I really have very little idea about suburban Ontario or even like metropolitan Ontario. But I guess I didn't even try to make that connection. I think I didn't think this was a reflection of any real society. And as you was pointing out that, this is something that I also, intuitively I thought that when it was getting published or even before that, Canadian society, could have been, because I've heard of, say, for instance, South Asian immigrants coming to the US or North America generally from the 60s onwards, right? So there were, I'm pretty sure the society was not, so that's why I think it's a pretty, Davis probably knew what he was interested in and the society, like the kind of structure that he probably, I was questioning it was even his intention to really realistically reflect society or anything like that.
I think he created caricatures. I think he created caricatures that suited his literary intent, which was the story that he was weaving and the structure of that story and the notion that, from the throwing of the first snowball in the beginning to the death in the water in the car at the end, every piece somehow connected. There was some linkage, and that linkage allowed him, I think, to construct a kind of moral tale, not about redemption, but about the opposite of redemption. And he did it in a way that was fascinating and very, very creative, but it is not, in my view, a reflection. And he had no duty. He wasn't a sociologist. He was a creative writer. He was a fiction writer to reflect the reality of Ontario sociology back then. That wasn't his mission. His mission was to tell a story, and to tell a story that, in his mind, was a creative reflection of a series of competing notions and biases about society and how people worked. And if you think about the stereotype of the politician, the stereotype of the big business person, the stereotype of the trophy wife, it's all there. Every stereotype is there. It's embellished. I mean, it's well done, but there's very little diversion from the stereotype. And I think all of us would be of the view, and I think people older than us would be of the view, and certainly people younger than us would be of the view, that society is much more complex than that and much more nuanced. And I don't know that he wanted to go there for the purposes of this novel.
But it's interesting because the first 100-page, Randy, you said that's good literature, and I think we always associate when somebody is writing about their own history, aren't we more tolerant, or do we like that? Do we have a certain affinity when about somebody writing for their childhood and they're growing up and so on? Does that make it more universal, is my point? Therefore, would justify saying the first 100 pages are more universal in spirit, and as you describe, have more power to sustain through time than maybe the last 100, which it's the clever way of finishing the story. Randy, any thoughts on that?
Well, I would respond to Hugh that way, in that I take your point, Hugh, very much about the later part of the book, and then also later books of Robertson Davies, where I think his Jungian interest led to certain types showing up over and over again that he then sort of riffed on. It's also a pretty straightforward kind of flat versus round character approach that novelists, I think, would take. I'd still defend, I think, the first 100 pages. Maybe one of the ironies of the book is that its international appeal was probably that it seemed exotic. Small town Ontario, as Davies was evoking it, to a New York or a London audience, might have seemed exotic to some degree. But what I would say again is, I think one thing that we're called to do as kind of self-aware, publicly engaged thinkers is to acknowledge our own historicity. And what we are perhaps critiquing of Davies and whiteness 50 years from now, so will someone be critiquing Boyagoda on brownness the same way? If I'm writing an autobiographical novel in which I have a kind of narrow Catholic Sri Lankan view of East End Toronto, or am I writing out of the depths of my personal life in a way that makes sense for larger audiences, I would hope, such as I can find these connections. So it's something I do in my teaching as well. I'm always very mindful of acknowledging my historicity in critiquing the limitations of others. The critiques are valid, but let's remember that we will be subject to them as well. And so, we always have to balance, I think, the generosity of spirit with the sharpness of our critical minds. And at least that's what I think we can, I think to that degree, and I think, Nathalie, you've really demonstrated as much in bringing us together today. I think Fifth Business sustains exactly these kinds of necessary conversations, as does Massey itself.
Well, what a wonderful way to conclude our gathering. So maybe a couple of from each of you, a couple comments about what you want to remember from this conversation about Fifth Business and what Massey should do now. So what's the next novel we should be discussing? Let's start.
I never want Hugh Segal to read my fiction in public. That's all I'm going to say.
So last words.
I think I agree with Randy that this discussion really represented not just, and I mean, this is the kind of discussion that we need to do with any literary work, and this really represented the spirit of conversation at Massey that we have today, and we are trying to nurture in a sense. Yeah.
Good. Hugh, a few last comments.
I guess I would say that if you think about some of the visiting authors that we've had at Massey over the years, some of whom have written some wonderful books, you can see that each generation reflects the perspective that they bring from their own background and their own context. And that's what he was doing to a certain extent, to be fair to him. And the good news is that every one of those reflections will be different and by definition retroactively judgmental on reflections made earlier. And that's part of the literary engagement, which I think is a good thing. So I think this book provokes that. And in that sense, it's very constructive. It doesn't mean we have to agree with all the caricatures and typifications, but it's important for us to understand them for what they were and why they may have been written 50 years ago.
Anyway, here we were 50 years ago. Fifth Business was published. It had been written at Massey College, and I had the privilege of being with people who read it again for your benefit and reflection. So I want to thank you all for being this. I want to thank again Ramsay and Derry and Judith Skelton Grant for doing the first part, which was lovely, so informative and so wonderful to have done that. Thank you very much. And also to our technical team, Matt Glenfield and Abra Rissi. Thank you very much for putting this together. See you soon.